A very good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for a fireside chat on the architecture of rare disease innovation, where we will unpack the science, regulation, and investment in sync. This chat is brought to you by Global Regulatory Services and Medidia in association with OtoImmune and Covesea Clinical Consulting. Today, we have with us an expert panel, Greer Deal, the co-founder and director of Global Regulatory Services, Joanne from Covesea Clinical Consulting, and Jason from OtoImmune. Thank you so much for joining us today. And of course, you are in this fireside chat because you know why does this conversation even matter? Well, nearly 300,000 people live with a rare disease. That's almost 1 in 17 people. And rare disease have limited natural history data, there's uncertain endpoints, complex immunology, heightened regulatory scrutiny, and significant investment risk. And this fireside chat will help us blend together scientific leadership, regulatory expertise, and investment insight. So before we begin this session, may I please request our panel members to just introduce themselves and share a bit about themselves with our audiences.
I'll kick off then. So Greer Deal co-founder director of Global Regulatory Services, and thank you very much actually for the introduction, and very pleased to be here today. Today is, like actually said, is a fireside chat, and I really wanted to be able to mark Rare Disease Day, which was actually on the 28th of February. So this is our effort to do that. And so we didn't want the day to go by. And rare disease is very important to me, not only professionally, but also personally, since I do have a rare disease myself. So I'm here in both a personal capacity and a professional. And Global Regulatory Services is all about the regulations of bringing innovative products to market. So I'll be talking a bit more about that later on. So Jason, over to you.
Thanks, Greer, and thanks everyone for having me. I am Jason Mellid, the CEO and co-founder of OtoImmune. It's a new company that is developing a platform to help patients better manage their care, understand how multiple omics coming together, including their genetic sequence of their whole genome, plus their blood test results, can lead to faster, more accurate diagnoses and a better understanding of the care plan that will be most impactful for them. Rare diseases is something that I've been passionate about, again, similar to Greer personally and professionally for many years, and it's a pleasure to be here. Over to you, Joanne.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Joanne James, and I run my own clinical consulting company in clinical development and preclinical development, and I've been doing I've had my company for a few years now, but I've been doing research in these areas for 30 odd years. So I came to rare diseases through my main background, which is in wound healing and tissue repair. I've worked in a number of wound healing diseases, rare and neglected diseases, including sickle cell ulcers, Buruli ulcers, and epidermolysis bullosa, which many of you might know about. I've also worked in rare disease, inflammatory diseases and autoimmune diseases for a number of years, looking at really the etiology of those diseases and how we can understand the diseases better in order to develop treatments for them. So that's my background, and that's why I'm here today. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. And thank you for joining us, Ron, Katie. So let's begin the session. A question for Greer. So to start us off, rare disease innovation often looks very different from traditional drug development. And Greer, from your perspective, what makes rare disease development fundamentally different?
The clue is already said. You've already said it. Is it's rare. It's because the challenge from a regulatory perspective is the lack of population that has the disorder, that has the disease, and to be able to bring something to market that has such a small population that is suffering from that disorder or that disease is really challenging, and we'll go into more detail about that with Jason and Joanne later. But for example, like the clinical studies, I mean, if you look at clinical studies that deal with just pain, I mean, you're talking thousands and thousands of candidates to join a clinical trial. Well, a rare disease by its very nature, it could be so rare that there's only a handful of people in the whole world that have that particular disorder. So, so how do you run those trials, and also how do you make it commercially viable for the company that's developing it? And you know, a lot of companies that are developing these products, they have a personal story, so they're not in it for the money, as people would say, but they still need to make ends meet. They still need to cover their costs as a minimum, and so this is where the regulators themselves, so the authorities, actually provide a lot of incentives to support companies that are developing these products for these rare unmet medical needs, because they still need looking after. You know, their lives are very frequently devastated by whatever disorder they have. So they need that support, and they need people to innovate in that space. So yeah, there are huge challenges, and what I find interesting actually is that you have a rare disease, which in itself, like I said, there's only a handful of people, and yet the rare disease community is massive. So how do we tap into that for the benefit of everybody in that rare disease community? And it's great actually to see the likes of the MHRA, the competent authority in the UK, and the HPRA, the competent authority in Ireland, and the US FDA really coming around to rare diseases. You see they're publishing things on their websites, and there's a lot of now proactive support for this particular space. So it's great to see that come through. We just now need to gather momentum and keep that going.
Thank you, Claire. And Joanne, like, because obviously, like we rightly said, although it's rare, there is a massive community out there still looking for answers. And because we know that many rare diseases have limited natural history data and small patient populations, like, according to you, how do researchers design these meaningful development programs when the science itself is still emerging? And I know you have a very vast background on this as well. So how do we start building or designing trials for like rare diseases?
So there are a couple of things. Sometimes the disease doesn't have much, there's basically a low level of understanding of the disease itself. So of course, we're trying to research what is actually happening in these diseases. And sometimes you take a group of diseases which might be similar. For example, I've worked on previously the autoinflammatory diseases, and there might be different types of autoinflammatory diseases. The ones I worked on had mucosal disease, but they might have connected eye disease, skin disease, gut disease. So there might be maybe a suite of diseases which are separate and rare, but a lot of them have the same symptoms. So we look at what's happening in the different types of diseases in order to gain a bit more information about them. And then we look at the genetic background, and we used to take blood samples, for example, mucosal samples, saliva samples, to look at which inflammatory cytokines or which inflammatory molecules are upregulated or downregulated, in order to get a bit more of a history of what is happening in these diseases. And you could say, well, it's a bit of a fishing expedition. You know, you're looking at all these things to find out what's happening. But first of all, we would look at the genetic background. And a lot of these types of diseases have, they might be a rare disease, but they've got a connected genetic background with similar genetics to others. So you can look at them as a group, even though they're rare. And sometimes you might want to design your trial in a similar manner. So some drugs, for example, that are designed for a particular type of disease, a rare disease, they might also be looked at for in the similar types of rare disease, even though they're different. So you might say, oh, this drug targets this inflammatory pathway, or this genetic group, would it be suitable to look at? And yes, that happens. So you might look at different types of genetic disease or inflammatory disease, which are similar but also different, and say, well, actually, that's the only way we're going to get more patients. But I think essentially it's trying to understand the background of the disease preclinically and genetically before you go into a trial. So there's a lot of that. And secondly, it's where you're designing a pharmaceutical maybe for one type of disease, to also look at whether it may be appropriate for the other type of disease, and so to expand out. So a clinical trial can be designed for more than one specific indication, and particularly in this, when you're looking at so few patients, quite often so few patients with one disease, you might say, well, shall we develop this and for multi-populations and view it as almost like a cohort study of those diseases, lump them together. And it's interesting that you said something like 1 in 17 of us might have a rare disease. So rare diseases are not rare, but another statistic is that only 1 in 20 rare diseases actually has a treatment, a developed treatment. So there's a long way to go. So first is understanding the disease better, and second is how can we use the similarities between these diseases to try and develop something for them.
And also, Joanne, we were talking earlier, weren't we, about real world evidence. So how could we bring that into all of this and get it accepted by the regulators?
Yeah, so the MHRA has this new pathway, the ILAP pathway, which is the Innovative Licensing Application Program. And they also are pushing something like very sensibly. So in this program, there's, I forget the name of it exactly. Oh, my brain has gone. But basically, real world data. So using existing data as your control. So we design the program differently. So traditionally, we've got maybe your safety study and then your placebo-controlled RCT, with your control group. And you need a lot of patients for this and try and see the differences. We cannot do that in these patients with rare disease because we simply don't have enough patients. And if we tried to get a statistically powered randomized controlled trial with so many patients, we might be years and years and years in the making. We're not going to help anyone. So the MHRA and others have got these programs whereby actually they're pushing the mantra that is actually unethical to design it like a normal trial with a placebo-controlled group. And instead, because we're never going to get any product to market if we try and do that in this case, and instead to use real-world evidence or actually external controls, so existing data. So your existing data, your historical control is your control arm. And Jason had a very good point, and I'm going to ask you to explain it better than me, is that we might ask the actual patients themselves to be their own control arm. So we take the history of the patients, how they reacted and how they lived their lives and how their disease developed before they go on into a trial, and then take them how they're acting within the trial, so they become their own controls. And I think that's how you explained it.
That's right. Maybe I can just come in real briefly. N of 1 clinical trials is a really attractive, let's say, path forward, particularly for the extremely rare diseases, because the idea that a single patient, not only off the back of their existing real world data, but also going forward, can be an AB N of 1 trial into themselves, can help accelerate the process rather than thinking you need to have a control arm in the traditional sense. So anything that can remove those barriers that have classically prevented people from developing drugs for the rare disease community, I think is a fantastic innovation.
Ron, would you like to?
Yes.
Yeah, Ron, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, I'd like to maybe add a point to the issue of placebo control. One of the problems is in rare disease that the communities are so small that they all know each other.
Yes.
And very often For example, in pediatrics, these kids are on social media all the time, and they're comparing notes. So differently than a trial in type 2 diabetes, you're going to have these 24 kids who all know each other, if not personally, then from social media. And they're going to figure out within days who's on the drug arm and who's on the placebo. And then what happens is everyone who figures out they're on placebo drops out of your trial and your statistics are blown. So that's like, even if you want to think of it objectively as a scientist, you have a situation where your control arm falls apart and you just can't count on it. So if your drug is any good,
Exactly.
if it
Yeah.
does anything, the placebo people are going to leave you.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. So what the sort of proposed better design of these kind of trials is to use historic controls, as in, so you'll use the data that you might have for these patients before you ever get into your trial, and you might use some of that and say, this is how this trajectory of these type of patients generally goes. Now let's look at these type of patients in this trial. So we're not really having a control arm. We're looking at the prior data. And your point there is a very good reason for doing that, exactly.
So Jason, I think you were saying earlier as well about what OtoImmune is doing with the platform, and where the individual themselves can compare their symptoms when they're on one treatment to another treatment. Did you just want to talk a little around that?
Yes, happy to, Greer. So leaning into this N of one kind of idea of self-experimentation, what we're setting up in our platform, it's an app and also a health test, genomic sequencing, etc., is allowing individuals with guidance to be able to run these kind of self-experimentation. So maybe they do 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, 2 weeks back on, 2 weeks off. We're even looking into possibly providing with partners a kind of placebo, depending if it's an official trial, if it's just something like a lifestyle change or using something that's available over the counter. So we feel that empowering the community and individuals to figure out for themselves what works and what doesn't work with guidance and structure, and then ingesting that information from multiple parties, it's not going to be completely unbiased, but allow us to start to recognize patterns that we can then track back to, let's say, genetic background, phenotype, etc., and really start to generate insights that way. The standard now is your traditional control arm and your case arm, but we feel that by empowering the individual to figure out and then report back to us what they are experiencing, both inputting information as well as wearables and more passive acquisition of that data, we'll be able to really start to pull together what we call multi-omic insights so that we can understand at a granular level what really is having an impact. And I think for the rare disease community, this is particularly important because there's so many people out there at a young age who get diagnosed because they present early on and they're sequenced in today's world and they get that diagnosis. But there are plenty of people who have rare diseases or even potentially haploinsufficient and are a carrier for rare disease mutation and they have no idea. So that's why we want to bring the genetic element into it as well as symptom tracking and other components to really create a platform that enables either the individual or in partnership with, let's say, a clinical trial that's registered and formal to allow people to experiment on themselves and report back.
That sort of brings me to the words I couldn't remember earlier, which was the MHRA's exceptional circumstances authorization. So in this case, which fits the rare disease specifically, is that they are willing and actually proactively looking for innovative designs where traditional design would be inappropriate or simply impossible. And that really fits what Jason's just said there perfectly. And the other things they are doing, and I think other authorities are doing the same, looking into doing the same, is we talked about real world data. The other things they're thinking about doing is the innovative methods, actually looking at in silico, and that fits kind of with what you're saying, in silico trials, where actually you're feeding the data in and or AI. So they are actually willing and proposing to push forward in that sort of thing in order that we can design these sort of trials without using the data, but without having to use the historic traditional trial design. So, yeah.
Maybe I could just come in real quickly. I know, sorry,
Carry on.
we're going off the agenda, but just to build on that, because I think it's really exciting. We are focused on immunological disorders. Some of those are rare conditions and inherited, others are things that are acquired in terms of autoimmunity. The infrastructure we're building, we think, is quite applicable across the board, and we're inspired by the rare disease community. Just coming back to what Ron said earlier, for some of these communities, they're so tight-knit, all the children or even the people in the community are communicating with each other on a regular basis. They know what it's like to have a quite unique genotype, phenotype driving their condition, having to advocate for themselves, and being treated differently from common disease. Immunology is quite unique and specific to the individual. And so we're looking at the rare disease community of how to create an environment and an infrastructure where it's attractive to treat us as individuals. So ironically, the problems and challenges the rare disease community has been facing historically is the direction of travel for precision medicine. Because as we start to get more granularity on really the subsets and subsets and subsets of common diseases, we need to have the ability to address those affordably. We know that companion diagnostics have revolutionized many areas of therapeutics. We also know a lot of pharma companies don't want to have a companion diagnostic because they think it will restrict the size of their treatable population. So the rare disease community is inspiration for the direction of travel for the broader medical community. If we can crack this, then we can set up a world where we truly are treated as individuals and have therapies that are tailored and most likely to work for us, rather than it always being population scale, one drug, one size fits all. So I think if we just kind of flip it on its head, the rare disease community are the pioneers, and this is where we can learn to how to treat the broader population.
Yeah, absolutely. And with the other thing I think we spoke about earlier was with rare diseases that talking as myself here, you have a myriad of symptoms and it takes forever to get a diagnosis. And that's the start of your journey, but that's your very first battle, is to be believed that you're having these symptoms and then actually to get a diagnosis. And I've spent 5 years achieving my diagnosis. And during that time, I was absolutely desperate, so much so that I actually had my whole genome sequenced with a blood test. And that threw up some things. And through that, I was able to drill down and get the support that I needed. So, Jason, you were referring earlier to sort of genome sequencing, and do you think that we're going to see more of that becoming, say, more mainstream? I mean, we said earlier about Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge that they're doing that for babies. Now, I saw the headline, sort of new babies will have their genome sequenced, but you quite rightly pointed out that only if they suspect something. But that's the trouble. You don't know until a long way down the line sometimes. I mean, I've reached, well, postmenopause, and I've only just found out there's something going on. So I don't know if you want to contribute to that, Jason.
Definitely agree. And the spot on is that we're at the beginning of a very exciting time. And as with the Human Genome Project and the 100,000 Genomes Project, the UK is pioneering, which is fantastic to see. What we need to do is make whole genome sequencing accessible, affordable, and actionable. Those three things. We are increasingly making it accessible. The cost is coming down because there's so much more competition. The chemistry is getting better, so it's becoming more affordable. But we have to make sure that it's actionable and fits into care pathways. So there are some loci that can be used for a diagnosis, others can be used to prognose how someone will progress with their disease. Still other loci can be used for pharmacogenetics to figure out which drugs may or may not be more efficacious or have a tox profile that maybe you want to avoid those. These are all things that are real world happening today. However, whole genome sequencing is not yet mainstream, but it will be increasingly. So companies like OtoImmune and others in the space, it's on us to work with the NHS and other healthcare systems to help make a whole genome as cost effective as possible. Otherwise, it's just a large data set. You look at it once and it doesn't really fit into the care pathway. So I think that it is a core element of where precision medicine is moving. We need to make sure that we have the tools to make it actionable and truly build on the value. And what I think is exciting is that it's a kind of investment that only grows in value over time. We are discovering new genetic loci on a regular basis. We could use it for earlier detection of things like cancer, etc. It can detect rare diseases in populations and people where perhaps their diagnosis would have taken years because it wasn't even on the front of their mind. I am a big proponent of whole genome with the right guardrails and support and infrastructure.
Absolutely.
Great.
Katie?
Yeah, sorry, just to add a little bit to that, if I may. I think what your last point, where you just said about not having the right guardrails and the right infrastructure, I just add to that. I have myself a little collection, quite proud of my little collection of autoimmune diseases, and which I've had for a very, very, very long time, and I am on the way trying desperately to get diagnosed for quite a rare disease, and I'm in several online communities. I have a medical background, I have a nursing background, I have a background in the healthcare industry, so I have sort of insight into this. But I'm a member of several online communities, several on Facebook, several Instagram communities. These communities are vociferously active, and many people do have their genome sequenced, and they are sort of, the communities are almost like bonding together and working together to solve their own problems, because they are having no support, no help at all from our health service, and they're going off and scarily they're diagnosing themselves. You've got people online who are running these communities who are actually charging people to there are people charging, come to me, pay me 50 pounds and I'll give you half an hour advice from my experience. There are people doing that at the moment in an unregulated way. There definitely are. It's an unregulated Wild West out there. So I watch from a distance and observe this, and I very carefully piece together my own sort of methods of managing my own conditions, which I've managed to do. So I think this is much needed, but because there's a whole load of stuff going on out there, which is not good.
If I can talk to that, I was saying earlier about rare diseases sometimes having similar but slightly different genetic backgrounds, and the types of diseases I used to work in a few years ago, we regularly, and we spoke about this morning in our pre-chat, we regularly saw patients who had taken 6, 7, 8, 9 years and been passed from pillar to post to pillar to post. And because their disease is rare, you go to your average GP or even dermatologist, they go to dermatologists when actually that's not their problem. They've got a problem with their skin, but they've got multi-symptoms. So they get passed from pillar to post, and it can take years, 9 or more years, to get to proper diagnosis. So that's not uncommon, sadly. And the other thing is, in Greer's situation, that's not uncommon either. So what often we find when we would genetically test people is that they have the background genes for X disease, and you can trace it back through families. And I was never really interested in genetics until I started working in these diseases, and I thought, wow, that's fascinating. You can trace them back through. But sometimes nobody in the family had it, but then you check, and actually maybe 3 generations before they knew they had this disease, this symptoms, but they never knew what they were. And often it takes a trigger factor, and people would say, well, I went on holiday to such and such, and when I came back I was ill. You get ill on the plane, and I've been ill ever since, and it's been years now. So quite often there's a change of diet, or a change in something, or a viral instigator, and then the disease flares up, and that's when you find the disease. But so the genetic background may always have been there, but then a trigger factor happens, and then the disease flares up. So a lot of these, and this is what I was saying earlier as well about different diseases, but with similar etiologies. So they often get misdiagnosed as one or the other. So we need to understand the actual disease, and as Jason says, we need to understand the genetics of the actual disease, and then we need to get a good diagnosis, and then we need to design something to treat that disease. But designing something to treat that disease is difficult until you really understand what you're looking at.
It's quite literally going back to the science of it all, to truly understand how and why something is happening, to be able to then start thinking about how you're going to develop a treatment, a therapy. And when you're thinking of that, how is the clinical trial going to be designed? So it's all, I think it's actually even more important in the rare disease community that we take those steps than it is in the sort of the wider general scattergun approach. Because there is so much strategic work in order to get a therapy, a treatment onto the market in order to meet those unmet medical needs.
Can I pick up on that point there?
Yeah.
That's very important. And Jason, you can so I was asking this morning, and I kind of know the answer, but for some form of conversation about getting to market. So often, as Greer said earlier, there can be people who have designed something or planned something or developed this because they have a family member or something, or an interest or a disease themselves, and then they focus on, I'm going to develop something for this disease. But what you often see is companies who develop a drug or a treatment or whatever it is, and it can be for cardiology or oncology, or can be for diabetes or blah, blah, blah. And then they say, oh, we'll go into orphan disease first because we'll get that first to market. Let's find an orphan disease that we can fit this in because we can get a fast route to market. Now, Jason can explain the good and the bad and the ugly of that strategy and what's appropriate.
Oh, Joanna, that's an excellent point to raise up. It is so true. It's how you go about doing it and when it makes sense, as opposed to thinking of it as a cheap, quick, dirty way to get to market faster. When you're doing it as, oh, aren't I very clever? I can kind of sneak into the clinic as quickly as possible. If only I could find an orphan indication that I could throw this drug at, that's not the way to do it. The other way to do it is when it makes sense, where the pathways you're targeting, the treatable population, the development pipeline, your real commitment to helping people access the orphan drug. It's not just about getting the approval, because sometimes drugs get approved and the price tag is so high, it was never designed to ever be used in the clinic or afforded by anybody, but you got that designation and you move on. There's a lot of unscrupulous actors out there, as we all know. It has to make sense. It has to be well thought out strategy. And there are now increasingly pathways that are being established by the likes of LifeArc and others to really help drug developers and funders think through, when does this great combo of rare disease and common disease clear over developing a drug, getting it to market with the intention of it actually being accessible by those patients, and then building from there to more common or broader diseases makes sense. There's only a handful, a relative handful, still important, but a narrow selection of rare diseases and orphan indications where that makes sense. And what we need to do is guide people towards them. It cannot just become a gimmick where people say, "Oh, I've got a quick and dirty way for you to get to market. Here you go. Just put in some patients," which unfortunately we have seen some people do. But I do think that there's a lot of opportunity that's underexploited. And increasingly, now that people are understanding that this is a pathway that can work effectively when done well with the right partners. For anybody who's listening to this, if you have any questions or are looking for partners, I'm sure that there's others out there who can guide you on that journey. But please do not exploit this community any more than it's already been exploited. It is not for you to just say, oh, I can get something on orphan indication. Let me just find a cause celeb. Really do your homework. Make sure that the biology, the clinical pathway, the reimbursement pathway, that all of that makes sense first. I think Ron has a point to raise. Yeah.
Yes. We do this all the time in my company. I'd like to believe we do it the right way and for the right reasons. What we actually do is, I mean, our work is based on working with patient groups. So that's the main pillar that the company is built on. But a lot of what we do is go and hunt for technology that very often is being developed for common indications, but can be useful for rare indications. And very often the situation is, like, I'll give you a generic example, but I have real stories in mind there of typically a university spin out that is started by very brilliant people with fantastic, results from PhDs, postdocs, or sometimes 20 years of research. And they spin out a company, and what they know about is obviously the big indications, and their early investors will also push them to go to type 2 diabetes, heart failure, Alzheimer, the pentad of like holy grails, whereas their technology can be very useful for diseases that they've never even heard about and don't know exist, and they're not going to be encouraged to go that way by anyone. And what we do is find these matches and actually show the company why it's a good idea to work on that. And that's one of our arguments. We say you can help people who are in real need, but it is also good for you because you can potentially do a trial and it's not quick and dirty. So you will be up to this, you'll be held to the same standards as any trial, and the regulators are not going to let you get away with a bad data, but you can still, by the nature of the disease, you can do a 2 or 3 site center trial instead of a 40-center trial. You can do a trial with, 40 patients instead of thousands, because that's what there is. This is the community, and this is something that is attractive to a small company, because that means you don't need a partner. You can actually go it alone, with a fairly manageable investment, and you can get huge support from the patient group. And that's the other point that I think is worth discussing. I don't know if that's in the cards to discuss that at all, but the patient associations, they bring together so much information. And again, this is something we do. We work with them to actually collate a catalog of research assets that they've got. Anything from data assets through, unmet needs and descriptions of medical unmet needs, all the way to disease models. I mean, some of these patient groups nowadays go and make their own mouse. And, when I was a postdoc, you needed 2 postdocs to work for 2 years to make a mouse. Nowadays, you need 30K and you go to a commercial lab and you have it done pretty quickly too. So many of them bring these assets, and that can save companies years of legwork, because all that you need essentially is to do a material transfer agreement and try your technology, your platform technology or your molecule on those model animals and see if there's proof of concept. And that can be done within months rather than years. So I just wanted to stress these points.
Thanks, Ron. I really appreciate that. The other thing we have talked about previously was how you can get certain charities involved, because a lot of charities actually now do have the ability to invest in research and in clinical trials. So absolutely everything you said, Ron, is spot on. And Jason, I think I'd like to bring you in to talk about the investment side of it as well.
Yes, at the top of what Ron said was, thank you so much for sharing that with everybody, because you're definitely doing it the right way, but you have to get the investment in order to actually do this. And so it's not just getting the confidence of the founders for these companies, it's making sure that there aren't the VCs who are steering them towards the big blockbuster lane, which seems to be a safer bet. And so we, coming from the venture community as well, need to understand and educate investors as to why this pathway for orphan indications for rare diseases is important and lucrative. Because venture philanthropy cares more about the impact. There's a lot of impact investing as well, where they want to show a real demonstrable impact, and that's their key ROI. There's a financial ROI, but also its impact, versus your traditional VC or traditional PE houses looking for that financial return. You can have both. You can have impact and you can have the financial returns. But we do also recognize that the traditional VC mindset is 1 in 10 of their companies will succeed and 1 in 10 of successes will be a blockbuster. unicorn or a decacorn or all these other new terms. And so I think as impact investing and venture philanthropy is really starting to rev up, we have alternative funding mechanisms, whether it be non-dilutive funding or even dilutive, that can back therapeutics that will really address these indications. And coming back to my point I said earlier, it's a bit of a positioning argument. And my favorite examples, I always talk about towels and hotels. You know, for years, environmental activists were trying to get hotels to stop washing their towels and sheets every night, and nobody cared. And the argument was, it's so bad for the environment. And then somebody said, well, actually, it's really bad for your bottom line. Do you know how much you could save in overheads if you stop washing? And then suddenly the industry flipped and they went, oh, that's a good point. And we can make it into a PR stunt. So you got the outcome you wanted, but the positioning is what convinced them. And I feel that in the rare disease community, from a funding standpoint, when you focus on the benefit to the patient, that resonates with some people. But we need to think about the financial argument to convince the VCs and the other traditional investors that this is where they should be backing and their money. Some of those things have come out in today's conversation, you know, the points that Joanne and Ron have raised, but it's something that we need to be very focused on as a community, presenting the argument in a way that the money people, quote unquote, understand so that the funding flows into the right companies. And the argument of impact and the unmet need resonates to a point, but we've got to make sure that we're always presenting that financial argument as well. And I do strongly believe there is a real good reason why investing in rare disease therapeutics is a strong, solid bet. We have to get better at conveying it.
And also, I think we need to get better at conveying it so that it's across the rare disease community, all the way across, rather than just looking at the sexier options almost,
Great, I
or the
couldn't agree
political.
more. You know, you see this in that, you know, for anybody listening, I don't mean this in a bad way, but I will say that even in the different charitable circles, you can imagine endangered species is one example. There's certain endangered species that get all the attention and all the funding, and they're not even the most impactful species in terms of environmental or you know ecosystem maintenance, but they are the popular species, so they get billions of funding. Whereas there's a long tail of other species, flora and fauna, that need support that don't get a look in. I think that rare disease, unfortunately, is like that. Some things like cystic fibrosis, multi-billions are available. Other diseases, most people have never even heard of them, but it doesn't mean that it's any less impactful. So we also, to your point, Greer, have to make sure that we bring everybody into the tent.
Thanks, Jason.
And this is coming back to Ron's other point about the patient groups. When I design trials, and in this case, we will try and design really small, innovative, clever trials with not too many patients. But the patient groups, we must always listen to the patient groups from the beginning. There's no point designing a trial and then asking the patient groups if it's good enough or have we got the right endpoints or how are we doing this. So we should talk to the patient groups at the very beginning. And some of these rare diseases are very, very rare. And we talked about one before that basically 4 patients in one country. So we have to broaden our horizons. I know we're all here in the UK, but we have to think we need to talk to the patient groups, but we might need to talk to patient groups globally to get enough patients to do any kind of a trial in some of these rare diseases. And that's where it comes into that we talked about at the beginning of this meeting. Sometimes you might have to think about 3 or 4 diseases that are a similar category, but or talking to more patients with the similar symptoms and saying, okay, is this drug good for X, Y, Z diseases? But talking to patients and their experience before you design the trial, not after, or not halfway through, or not when you're in it, but from the beginning, we need their input.
I just want to say real quick before, I know we're running up on time, but coming back to a point that I raised earlier and building on what you said, Joanne, too, is the rare disease community is an inspiration for the future of precision medicine. When I look in the autoimmune space that we're supporting, and everybody on my team pretty much has an autoimmune condition, or we have close family members with autoimmune conditions. I've got an autoinflammatory condition, so we're all living this ourselves. And something that I've noticed is that when I have friends where, let's say, 2 of them have been diagnosed with lupus. One is on hydroxychloroquine, and she's been stable for the past 10 years. The other one's been in and out of hospital, regular flare-ups, biologics, nothing is working. You cannot tell me that just because they have lupus, that they have the same condition
Yeah,
by
no,
any means.
exactly,
They do
totally. Yeah,
not.
no, yeah.
Right? And so when you go into a chat room, when you go into a therapeutic regime, and everything is just about lupus, 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 and you realize actually these old archaic terms, they're so broad, but there's so much nuance and so many different subtypes within. But from a therapeutic and a reimbursement standpoint, they just want to have a broad brush. Like, you've got disease X. They're not really considering all the different layers and facets like you brought up, Joanne. So I think we have to look at the rare disease example. Let's crack this so that when it comes to common diseases or more the broader community, we can start looking at the real niche subtypes of driving mechanisms and get better outcomes for patients. Because today, there's no clear path for making that financially tractable. They assume that you have to have one drug and everybody gets the same, as opposed to, oh, well, maybe if I do precision profiling of this person, I can really tailor or develop a regime for them. We have to get away from that. And the rare disease community is our pathway to the future for everyone.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, exactly. When we were looking at people with rare autoinflammatory diseases, exactly that. One person will have blindness or eye problems, one person will have skin problems, one person will have gut problems, one person will have headaches, migraines, and they will have the same disease but really different patterns of symptoms. And you can't lump them all together. You say, oh, they've got that disease, but they have completely different symptoms. And Katie is talking about people online talking about all theirs and diagnosing themselves, and that's really what we don't want. I mean, I think as a healthcare system, we have to get better at understanding the diseases. So I think understanding the diseases, understanding the pattern of the diseases, and precision medicine for them is really key to getting precision medicine for other things as well. I can't agree more.
And also the other thing is actually, okay, you may be diagnosed with this particular condition, but your symptoms are so varied that you need to be treated holistically.
Yes.
And, you know, I mean, we've all seen it in real life, but also on TV programs and in films where they say, oh, that's the cardiac patient. Well, that's, you know, so-and-so patient. And you're defined by this like disease. And it's like, but we're not in silos. I mean, it's like, I think Katie will empathize here, but, you know, what I have is it touches every single biological aspect of my body. Neurological, my gut, you know, skin, everything, and yet our Western medicine can't cope with that. It wants to put me into a silo, but I'm not. And the thing that is bringing all those symptoms together is the cause, and that's it. So yeah, it's so complex. One thing I wanted to ask though, Joanne, is at what point would you recommend that companies go for scientific advice with the regulators? Is there like a sweet spot or?
Yes. So actually, the new MHRA guidelines are you must go you must go early. I always advise people to go early anyway.
Yeah.
I said go early, go right at the beginning, but it's a mandatory pre advice and very early, as soon as you think of it, really. And so if you say, well, I want to develop something for X rare disease, before you pin down the protocol, before you do anything else, before you've got your beginnings of your synopsis, but go then. So they basically have devised this now as a mandatory pre-discussion meeting. So as early as possible, yeah.
But you need to go prepared though for it. You can't just walk in and say, this is what I'm thinking of doing.
No, you need
what
to go
should I do?
prepared. Yeah, exactly. But it is a mandatory determined meeting. And what I would say is know enough about your product and about the disease that you say, right, we are ready, we are thinking about going into a clinical trial. So we mentioned earlier in our notes about a case study, and without going into details of a case study, one product, a drug that I've actually helped to get to market, they did a very large clinical trial on a very rare disease, a really super debilitating rare disease, wound healing disease. and eventually were going to the FDA for approval. And one of the sticking points was, what is your mode of action? And they said, oh, it does this and we do this, but how does it do it and what? So that's when they came to me, and I worked with them for 18 months on a whole mode of action program, and then finally got approval and marketing authorization. And now then they had an M&A. So it was a real good success story in the end, but it took them a while to get there because there was a sticking point, and they had this great thing that they'd already done their clinical trial. So my advice is find all that out early. So if you want clinical trial authorization in the first place, you should really know what is your mode of action of this drug, and why are you using this drug to target this disease? And that's because it does X, Y, Z that is particular for this type of disease, and it suits it perfectly. And this is why we're using this drug for this disease, because it does this. Not, we're going to use this drug for the disease, but we don't really know how it works or why. Yeah. So
Yeah.
yes, go for your pre-advisory meeting, but go prepared with why you're looking at it in this disease type, what your drug is, what it does, and how. So that's what you should know when you go for your meeting.
Yeah, and if it is a startup, you know, the entrepreneurs themselves, they'll understand, or they should understand, the science behind it. So their passion of their understanding of the science will come through. But if it's just them and they haven't got the clinical regulatory expertise, my recommendation is get that full team together so you can work with each other at the same time going through this process, because it's not really stepwise. It's like everything has to be done almost at the same time. And certainly your regulatory and clinical strategy must work hand in hand. So it's very important that you have a close-knit team that can work well with each other. And like Joanne said, be well prepared to go for your scientific advice meetings with the regulators, so that you get the best out of those meetings, actually, which gives you even, gives you the confidence to carry on, and gives you the right steer, from the regulators of what you should be looking at, and if there are any gaps, how you address those gaps, etc. And it's a lot of effort up front, but longer term, it's actually shortens the process to get onto the market.
It absolutely does, because you might be surprised, because most people will be thinking that they have to run a clinical trial to get to this rare disease indication. But actually what the current standards are is that they encourage these clinical trials to be much smaller, much more innovative, actually, with no control group, using historical controls or the one-on-one controls. So people might be surprised. They need to do a lot less than they think they need to do, need to sort of look at it in a new way rather than a traditional way. And one other thing I would say is, whilst we were talking about the MHRA and whatever as well, is that when I talked about the global patients being so few, we might need to look at other countries. We must always keep in mind the global regulatory standards as well. And that's why you're called Global Regulatory Services. But for a little plug there, but for orphan diseases, we are likely to orphan diseases, we call them in the US, rare diseases, we are likely to be looking at patients in different countries. We need to make sure that our trial standards fit those different regulatory bodies, which I always do anyway, but some people might be focused in the UK or might be focused in where they are based, but I always say, let's look at the broader picture.
Yeah, well said, Joanne.
Thank you. It's been quite insightful and interesting to hear your thoughts on this. A question for all the panel members, looking forward, over the next decade, according to you, what are the shifts or developments you think that will most accelerate this innovation in rare disease?
I think that's
Jason.
Well, I think, we've talked about genomic sequencing becoming mainstream. I think will be huge. There will come a day when everybody is sequenced at birth, to Greer's point earlier, and it's not just the children who have a suspected condition, but everyone. And I think that's going to surface a lot of really valuable information to catch some of these conditions earlier and better guide care. I think also that there are new modalities that are being developed on a regular basis that can finally address these rare conditions in a way that wasn't possible before. So it's not just biologics and small molecules, but some of these advanced therapies, as we hone them, as gene editing or some of the cell therapies become more and more robust, we'll be able to treat a lot of these diseases. Things that we never thought we'd be able to treat in our lifetime or ever, we're now seeing that actually there's some really powerful treatments coming through that are looking to be developed. And I guess, real quick, the third one would just be I'm a big fan of inclusivity. And I think that increasingly we are tapping across industries and across geographies to find people with real innovative solutions. And I think that is going to accelerate across the board innovation, full stop. So the more that we can reduce the barriers towards anybody out there with a brilliant idea, the better. And I see that's the direction of travel.
Thank you, Jason and Joanne. Greer, yes.
I was going to say mine's a bit more basic, and that is education in the healthcare systems so that the clinicians themselves can recognize rare diseases. Now, they're not going to be able to diagnose them all, but to actually really listen to the patient and really understand that they truly have got all these symptoms. It doesn't fit into anything neat. All the tests have come back normal or maybe borderline. So it's knowing when to refer to the specialists, and understanding that the prevalence of rare disease is actually increasing across the board. The rare disease in itself may be a very small part of the population, but the whole community is much larger. And so not to write people off as being, it's all in your head. It's like what you're suffering is very true. It's very real. I'm here to support you, so that's supporting. And so through the support network and the education, then that's going to build a very strong foundation for all those future innovations. That's how I feel. So kind of underpinning exactly everything that you said, Jason, but yours is a little later on down the line.
Thank you, Greer. Joanne, would you like to share anything from your end?
I think I've said everything. I mean, there's always more, but I think I've said a lot for today.
I think from my perspective, Joanne, I think because of your niche area of clinical trials, it's being more imaginative with how you design the trials, but also ensuring that the regulators themselves are receptive to these new designs, really.
Well, which I think they are. In
Yes.
fact, they are encouraging of it.
Which is great. So we should tap into that.
The MHRA are looking now for rare disease at AI to try and look at the patterns of disease, using that as your controls, looking at historical, and I said previously, in silico, and Jason said your one-to-one or your one-on-one. The regulators are actually encouraging of small innovative trials, and almost saying that actually we don't want you to do large normal trials. Think outside the box. This is how you design a trial. Well, no, this is how you kind of historically design a trial. If you've got 4,000 10,000 patients in a cancer, they're all the same. Even they're not all the same, as Jason's just been saying. Actually, we might lump, breast cancer patients, they're all the same, even though they're not, but we're learning all that all the time. But in this incidence, the regulators are pushing for trying to be different. We've got to rethink how we design clinical trials. It's very formulaic. There's a formulaic way of designing clinical trials, and people will say, this is how you do it. This is not it. We need to think new. We need to think a little bit more clever than that.
Yeah, maybe I just want to quickly come in with another plug. I know Joanne mentioned it earlier, but there's nothing wrong with using all these amazing AI tools and all these other platforms, but it cannot replace the kind of expertise you would get with a Greer or a Joanne in your corner. So not only should you be engaging early and not thinking that, oh, the regulators are here to hold us back, or no, engage early, but get expertise like this. It makes all the difference. I have lived the painful experience of not engaging soon enough. Never again. You engage early with the right people, you go hand in hand, and ChatGPT is lovely, but it does not compare.
No, it
Just wanted
doesn't.
to say that.
Yeah, thank you. I can't tell you how many clinical trial protocols have been sent my way because people have done something wrong. And please, can you help us get out of this mess? Yeah. So I would rather somebody came early. We're talking about talking to the regulators early, but I would say if you have an idea, if you have a plan, or if you have a rare disease that you want to look at, talk to somebody who understands the clinical development pathway early. Talk to someone who knows what they're doing. Me, maybe someone else if you want. Talk to the regulatory people early. Don't come to us when we've done this trial or we've written this whole trial, but actually we're in a bit of a mess. We don't know how to get out of this mess. Start early, and it could save you a lot in the long run, time and funds.
Thank you. That brings us to the end of our fireside chat. Thank you so much to our panel, Greer, Jason, and Joanne. You have unpacked so much of experience, knowledge, and expertise. It has been so interesting to hear your thoughts on this. And I'm sure companies, people, communities will have so much to take back from this conversation. Thank you, Katie and Ron, for joining us, and to all our audiences. And keep an eye on our LinkedIn pages of our panel members as well. Do connect with them on LinkedIn and feel free to get in touch. And keep an eye on our social media for more such interesting fireside chats for future. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Good to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take
Bye-bye.
care. Bye-bye.